Good morning, teachers and students. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. We will get started in just a few more minutes. Thank you so much for being here. All righty. Good morning, everyone. We are so happy that you are here. My name is Will Tapia, and I'm the Advancement Coordinator with Big Brothers, Big Sisters of Central New Mexico. Good morning and happy Monday. I want to welcome you all to our 6th annual Discovery Festival. This event is super fun. So I'm going to first just real quick talk about what this event normally is outside of a pandemic and then kind of where we're at now. So outside of a pandemic, Discovery Festival is a one-day event held at the Albuquerque Convention Center in about mid-November. We get 3,000 students from all across Central New Mexico and 50 plus exhibitors. It's always free for our students and always free for our teachers. It's a super blast. And for this one-day event, it's all about hands-on STEAM demos. And as we all know, STEAM stands for science, technology, engineering, art, and mathematics. So it's a huge blast for the kids, for the exhibitors, for the teachers. But of course, this year, due to the novel COVID-19 pandemic, we are unable to do that event in person. However, as you all know, since you're all here, we've decided to move the event completely online for the entire month of November. So instead of in-person exhibits, where you might have 50 exhibitors you have to get through in a day, we're staggering this out throughout the month of November. We are inviting our exhibitors onto a live stream to do exhibits, to answer your questions, and hopefully make this a fun and exciting time, even in the midst of all this wackiness that we find ourselves in inside of 2020. So I'm going to lay a couple of ground rules here as well. So if anything happens to the live stream, I don't think it will, but we all know how technology can be sometimes. So the live stream goes down, or if there's any issues for whatever reason, just come right back here to this YouTube page, our YouTube channel. That's BBBS CNM, okay? And that, of course, stands for Big Brothers, Big Sisters of Central New Mexico. So go right back here to this YouTube channel, and we'll have the live stream back up if anything crazy happens. Again, I don't think it will, but you never know in technology these days, right? So I also see, this is super awesome. You're using the live chat. That is great. That's what we want. That's what it's there for. So if you have any questions at all, at any point during this presentation, please type it in that chat and your questions will be answered live on the live stream. That's what's very cool. And of course, if you type into where you're watching from, we'll give you a shout out. I see that Miss Hayden is already using that chat. She says that Lowell Elementary's 3rd grade, 4th grade, and 5th grade are watching and are present. Welcome, Lowell Elementary. We are so happy that you're here on this beautiful Monday morning. So I do want to quickly give a sponsor shout out as well. Let me see here. I have my 15 screens open, I think, as we all probably do right now. But a big shout out to our sponsors for this program. You know, what you're seeing and what we're doing here would not be possible without their continued community support. So thank you so much to our presenting sponsor, our Da Vinci presenting sponsor, Honeywell. Thank you so much, Honeywell. They're coming on the program tomorrow morning at 9:30. So in 24 hours, Honeywell's coming back on the program. So be sure to watch and check it out. They're always a blast every single year. And I think you'll get a kick out of their presentation. So check it out tomorrow morning at 9:30. Thank you, Honeywell. To our Curie sponsor, Fidelity Investments. Fidelity is another fantastic community partner of ours, and they have been for many years. They're always a big hit at the festival. They normally have a 3-booth display with all kinds of fantastic stuff going on, and the kids love it. So again, thank you, Fidelity, for your partnership during this crazy year of 2020. We are so appreciative for that. To our ride sponsors, to Aztec Machine and Repair out in beautiful Bloomfield, New Mexico, and to Air Force Research Laboratories. AFRL, Air Force Research Laboratories, are coming on tomorrow after Honeywell's presentation. They're going to be talking about satellites. That's going to be very, very, very cool. So please be sure to check that out. To our Newton sponsors, the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, DTRA, who's coming on this morning. Thank you so much, DTRA, for your sponsorship. To Micronet Solutions, to Sandia National Laboratories, and to Presbyterian Hospitals. Thank you so much to all of our Newton sponsors for your partnership. Okay, great. I think that's all the ground rules and everything I needed to say. I always forget something. But don't forget, hey, please, students and teachers, keep using that chat, post questions. Teachers, if you're streaming this YouTube video into your Google Classroom or wherever you're at, and your kids are asking questions, please post it in that chat. We want to make sure that this stays engaging and exciting for the kids to hear their name and their class on this live stream. So thank you so much. Without further ado, I'm always very long-winded with this stuff, so I'm going to bring in our presenters for this morning. I'd like to give a special introduction to our wonderful friends over at DTRA. This is DTRA's STEM Outreach. Do we have you there?
We're here.
Awesome.
Hi, Will.
Okay, great. Welcome to the stream. Like I said, I always am long-winded for these, so I know the kids and the teachers are already tired of hearing me talk, so I'm going to just totally pitch it over to you guys, and I'll see you in a little bit.
That sounds great. Thank you so much.
All right, well, we're just going to quickly introduce ourselves, and then we'll get into the fun stuff. So I'm Kayla.
I'm Chris.
And I'm Jennifer. And we are a team who does STEM outreach for K-12 students like you all for the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, or DTRA, as Will said. And we're really excited to be here today with you guys to do a little bit of science. We're going to focus on the S in STEAM, and we're also going to focus on the E in STEAM and do a little bit of science and engineering. In order to do science today with you, we're going to need you to help us by making some observations. Do you know what an observation is? If you have an idea about what an observation is, go ahead and type it in the chat box or have your teacher type it in the chat box. Observations are really important for doing science. We have to be able to do observations. Chris, can you fill us in and tell us what an observation is?
Sure. An observation is using any of your senses to make inferences and draw conclusions about what's around you, the environment you're in, and the things that that environment is doing.
Thanks, Chris. That's exactly what an observation is. We've got to be able to use our senses. I think I recall that we have 5 senses, but I'm not sure exactly what all those senses are. Do you know what those 5 senses are? I wonder if you could type them into the chat box, or if you could have your teacher type them into the chat box. 5 senses, ways that we could observe the environment around us. Chris, why don't you help us out again?
Okay, I'll give it a shot. Tasting, seeing, hearing, smelling, touching.
Perfect. Okay, 5 senses. Now I remember those. Well, we're coming to you over the internet. So some of those senses are going to be a little bit more difficult for us to use. Today, we're going to be focusing on using your sense of sight as well as your sense of sound and hearing. So let's see if we can use those senses to make some observations. I'd like you to make some observations about what I'm doing now. I wonder if you can use your senses and make some observations. If you make any observations, please type them into the chat box. Have your teacher type them into the chat box. What do you observe? What do you see? What do you hear? What's going on here? I'm doing a bit of an experiment of sorts. You may be saying to your teacher right now, the candle was burning. She blew the candle out. The wax was starting to melt. The wick was burning and is now charred. Are you saying some of those things? I hope that you are. I hope that you are making observations about what you see. Did you make any observations about what you hear? Did you hear the wick sizzling? Those are all some observations that I hope that you're making right now. That is a tasty candle. Did you make some observations about this candle? Did you call it a candle as you were talking about it? What do you think? Was it a candle? You don't know me very well yet, but I would not just eat a candle. So what could it be? It's not a candle at all. Do you have any thoughts about what it really is? This is string cheese, which is a tasty treat. But when you were talking about it and making observations, doing your science, you may have accidentally jumped to the conclusion that it was a candle. We have to remember when we're doing science that we need to make observations of what happens, not what we think is happening. Something was burning. Something started to smell like burning. Something was sizzling. In this case, the thing that you may have called a wick was actually a little sliver of an almond. But you wouldn't have had a way to know that from where you are. As you're doing science experiments, just make sure that you're recording data that's actually collected, not things that you think are going to happen. We're not going to make inferences. We're going to try to make observations of fact. We're going to use those skills that you just practiced of observation, along with some engineering design skills, and solve a problem. So I'm going to ask Kayla to come on over and tell you a little bit more about the problem that we'd like to solve.
Hey, everybody. So while Chris and Jennifer and I are here in Tennessee, many states away from New Mexico, we have a lot of friends in New Mexico who were recently telling us about some snow that you all had, some unseasonable early snow for many of you in the state. So that got us to having some conversations. Oh, what kind of problems are arising when there is an unseasonable snowstorm? Did that cause issues for transportation? Did it allow people to have extra fun? Was there any problems for the plant life or the animal life in New Mexico? So we started to have conversations about this, and we thought, you know, we could ask a lot of different questions about the effect of that early snow that had on the state of New Mexico. And the one that we were most interested in was, let's think about the animals. Were there animals who had extra problems because of this early snow? Likely. How could we help for that for next time? Could we Could we plan to build small shelters that would allow the animals a warm place to be, to get them out of the elements, out of the snow? What other kinds of questions would we have to ask? Could you think of some questions that you would need to ask if you were thinking about building a shelter for animals? A shelter that would keep them out of the snow. Some questions I might ask would be things like, well, how do I keep the snow off of the animal? How do I keep them warm? What color would it need to be? How large? What kinds of animals might need to use a shelter? Do I need to build a shelter for a bear? Does that make sense in New Mexico? Would I need to make a shelter for a cat? Depends on the area that I'm at. Does the shape matter? What kinds of other questions would we need to ask when thinking about designing a shelter for animals to help them withstand a snowstorm? As we think about those different kinds of questions, we need to think about how we would test those questions to get the right answers. So we've chosen a few of those questions to deal with today. Chris is going to work with you on the first one now.
So one of the first questions that we have to ask ourselves, is what kind of shape do we want this shelter to be? I mean, we know that for something to be shelter, it has to be enclosed, that we have to have a shape that we're going to create that's going to create an enclosure to keep these animals warm. So what other important considerations do we have to consider whenever we are making a shelter? We know that one of the primary concerns is snow coming down on the roof of a shelter. Now, I want you to think for a second. What could happen to that snow as it keeps coming down on the roof of any type of shelter? Well, we have designed some experiments to see what would happen whenever that snow does come down. Now, unlike you guys in New Mexico, where you have gotten a lot of snow recently, here in Tennessee, we haven't. We don't have any snow at all with which to use in this experiment. So we've had to substitute sand for snow. We have several different shapes of housing, shelter that we're going to use with this snow, with this sand, to simulate what would happen. The first shelter shape that we have is just a box. Now, Jennifer has this box with some sand, and she is going to pour the sand on it like it would happen if the snow was coming down out of the sky. Now, as she's doing this, observe. What do you see as she's pouring the sand on top of the box? What is happening? What did you observe? Now, think for a second. What if that sand was snow? What would happen if that snow was coming down on the roof of that shelter?
Chris, all of this sand stayed on top of this shelter.
So what would happen if that was actually wet snow?
Wet snow is so heavy. I've seen it do some really dangerous things like knock trees over and knock down power lines. So I think that if this were wet, heavy snow, it might collapse our animal shelter.
That wouldn't be good for animals. So the shape of a box shelter might not be adequate for meeting the goal that we have with having these animals in a very warm, enclosed shelter. So let's try a different shape. Let's try an igloo shape and see what happens. So as Jennifer's pouring the sand on this igloo, again, observe and see what happens. So as she's pouring it on there, what is happening to the sand? Is it the same as what was happening when she was pouring it on the box? Is something else happening?
Chris, the igloo has almost no sand on top of it.
Oh,
All the sand just fell off.
that's different. That's not what we saw with the box. With the box, we saw that it collected on the roof. So an igloo doesn't hold it there. Now, an igloo is harder to build and harder to construct than a box. You've got different geometric shapes that have to come together to create the angled roof. You've got the sides, which are totally different than the angled shapes of the roof. It's not as uniform as a box, but yet it kept the sand off. How can we modify the box to keep the sand off? Think for a second. How might you modify the box to keep the sand off the roof? One thing we could do is use an A-frame roof and place it on top of the box. If we do that, what do you think will happen?
Chris, this shape looks a lot more like the igloo, but it sure was easier to construct than the igloo.
Exactly. Now, Jennifer, can you simulate a snowstorm?
Here we go.
As she's doing this, observe what is happening with the sand. What's happening? Where is the sand going? Is it any different than what you've seen before?
There's no sand on top of my A-frame roof.
So we used a box house, an A-frame roof with angles, and it kept the sand off. With what we've done so far, we can start to plan a shelter. We can start thinking of different materials that we would use to build a shelter that would adequately enclose an animal and keep the heat from escaping. Now, Kayla's going to come back over and start talking to you about different types of materials and some ways that these shelters could be built.
All right, so now we've talked about what kind of shape would be useful, but we need to think about the material that we build it out of as well. So, there are a lot of different factors to consider. What kinds of materials do you think building a shelter out of for an animal would be useful? There's a lot to consider here. We would want to consider the cost. We would want to consider, is that material able to be made in the shape that we want it to be easily? We want to think about, will it do what we want? Will it keep the snow off? Will it allow the heat to stay in? We'd want to make sure that the material was an insulator. If I'm cold, what do I do to keep myself warm? What materials do I use? Do I wrap myself in a blanket? Could I make an animal shelter out of a blanket? Does that make sense? Will it get wet? How could I keep the animal dry and warm? What other questions would you need to ask in thinking about materials? I think the most important question to think about is, which material will help keep the heat inside of the shelter? The heat is coming from the body of the animal, but we want to keep that heat in as much as possible instead of letting it get out into the outside of the shelter to keep the animal warm. What if it starts to lose its heat? What will happen? Is the shelter doing what we need it to do? We need a material that's an insulator. Do you know what insulators are? Have you heard about conductors and insulators? Conductors are materials that allow heat and electricity to flow through them easily. And an insulator is just the opposite. An insulator does not let heat or electricity travel through it easily. So if we use a material that is an insulator, it will allow the heat to stay inside. So how do we know what kinds of materials are insulators? Well, we could do an experiment. We have set up an experiment for you that checks 3 different types of materials to see if they are insulators or not, or how well they insulate. So the experiment that we did uses a hot plate, which is just like it sounds, a plate that gives off heat. It's representing the animal in this case. We took 4 beakers, glass beakers, and put different materials inside the beakers. The materials that we put in were aluminum, wood, and styrofoam. They're all the same size and the same amount. Then, as you can see, we placed an equal size piece of ice in each of the 4 beakers. So really what we're trying to test here with our experiment is which material allows the heat to stay below the ice. Okay, so we don't want the heat from the hot plate to travel through the material and melt the ice. Melting the ice means that the heat is getting out. Imagine our shelter. If we have an animal inside the shelter, we want the heat that's generated by that animal's body to stay inside the shelter and not be able to transfer through the material in order to melt the ice. So in order to find the best insulator, we want to see which ice cube melts the slowest. What you can't see is the 4th beaker in the back, which doesn't have any material insulating it. In an experiment, it's always good to know what happens just normally without a tested material. And then we can compare the results from the tested materials to that which didn't have any material, the beaker without any ice in it. So as you can see in this video right now, the aluminum melted so quickly. It melted in just a few minutes. This video has been sped up. You can see the amount of time at the bottom being counted in minutes. At 43 minutes, all of the ice is melted except that of the wood, which is really surprising for us. Our team had a different hypothesis. We had a different guess. We guessed that the aluminum would melt really quickly, but we hypothesized that the one that would last the longest, the ice that would last the longest on top, thus being on top of the best insulator, was styrofoam. Here in a minute, we'll look at the data from this experiment to see exactly how much time each of those things took to melt the ice which was on top. Let's go ahead and pull up that data table. So as you can see, the control, which was the beaker without anything in it, just ice, melted in 14 minutes. The aluminum melted just 1 minute more slowly. It was not a good insulator at all because it melted in almost the same amount of time as the control. We also have the styrofoam, which took 36 minutes to melt. That means that the styrofoam kept the heat away from the ice much better than the aluminum did. It was a better insulator. But in the case of this experiment, the wood was proven to be the best insulator. Again, that was unexpected for us. So as a scientist or as somebody performing experiments, I would want to, in a perfect situation, run this experiment more times. I'd want to try to run it as many times as possible in the exact same way, the same amount of ice and the same amount of insulator with the same amount of heat, so that we can make sure that our answer is correct. Today, we don't have time to do it multiple times, so we're going to make our decisions based upon the information that we gathered from this experiment. But maybe that's something that you could do with a teacher later on. Remember, experiments results are always better when they're done multiple times. Chris?
So based on the results of the 2 experiments that we've done so far, the one with the sand acting as the snow on the roof, and with the experiment that Kayla just did with you showing which insulator would be best, we can use that information to determine how to build our shelter. Now, based on those results, we are going to choose the insulator of wood and then the shape of an igloo to create a shelter to house and enclose an animal so that it will stay warm and the heat will not escape. So what we're going to do now, and what you can see behind me, is Kayla drawing this shelter. Now, she has started drawing with this shape, and she's adding different characteristics to it. Now, other than the shape and the insulator, what are some other things to think about when designing this shelter?
What should the shape of the door be?
What would the shape of the door have anything to do with keeping heat in or letting heat escape?
Absolutely. I think that the shape of the door could let more heat out if it was too large.
Exactly. We have to consider the shapes of the openings that we have within the shelter that we are building because we want to keep the maximum amount of heat possible inside the shelter. What else can we think about?
What kind of animal is going to come into our shelter? If our door is too small because we're trying to keep all the heat in, we may not get the right kind of animal to come in.
That is very true. That's another consideration we must make. What else? What are some other considerations and some other things we have to think about whenever we're doing this?
You know, Chris, if I am building a shelter for an animal, I want to think about the other things that this animal is going to need other than just warmth and then heat. If I completely shut this off so that the animal's heat stays in, will that cause other problems?
Well, come to think of it, they might need a food source. They might need some water. We've got to have enough space for that, don't we?
They also need to be able to breathe. If we shut it off completely, they might not have enough oxygen.
How can we solve that problem?
What if I draw some air vents? Okay, and these air vents are angled in such a way that the snow can't get in and that rain wouldn't get in, but it still allows the air to go in and out and allows the animal to breathe well.
That's a great idea. We want to make sure that the animal has fresh air. We wouldn't want to be stuck in any place where there's no vent, no air exchange, no air coming in. We certainly don't want animals to experience that either. Are there any other considerations that we must make? Anything else we need to think about whenever we start to build this shelter? What about color? Would color have any bearing or any significance to keeping warmth in?
I want it to be purple.
Why purple?
Well, I think that it's pretty, and I want the shelter to look pretty because it might be near my house. I don't want to look at something ugly.
I don't think anyone would want to look at anything ugly. I think purple's a great color.
You know, I might have a different opinion about that. I might say, you know, I live in an area that has some rock features. So I'd like it to blend in. And instead of being a bright purple igloo in my neighborhood, maybe I want it to look like the rocks that are already there so it blends in better.
I wonder if we could use the color to help it be warmer.
Is there any color that helps keep heat in or help trap heat?
I think I've done an experiment one time that showed that more heat from the sun's light is absorbed by things that are black than by things that are purple.
So you're suggesting that black might be a good color to help hold even more heat in and keep the animal warm.
If our biggest concern is keeping the animal warm, we might want to go with a black igloo.
I think so. I think black might be the best color to use if we're trying to keep it as warm as possible.
Here's a question, Chris. If we wanted to see what the best color would be, let's say we're trying to attract heat, could we design an experiment for that?
We could. We could design an experiment using different colors and then measuring the temperature that each of those colors absorb. Is there anything else that we need to consider? Possibly the location? Would the location of the shelter matter?
I think that we would definitely want to place them in places where the animals were, the animals that we were trying to serve. How would we find that information, do you think, Jennifer?
Oh, we could do an experiment. We could make some observations of which types of animals are in different locations and create a data table to keep track of where there are bears versus roadrunners versus cats. Because each one of those types of animals would be interested in a different type of shelter. I don't think that you would have the same shelter for a roadrunner that you would have for a cat. So I think it'd be important for us to do that sort of observation and experiment to collect that data before we choose a location to build this.
That you bring up a great point. Would we also need to consider places for the shelter where we don't have an animal that is prey to something else near the shelter that its predator is at?
That's a great point, Chris. We definitely don't want to accidentally set something up so that it gets eaten.
Man, these are some great considerations. So we have more than just the shape and the insulator. We have to think about color. We have to think about door size. We have to think about vents. We have to think about location. Wow, with all of this, we have started to design a great shelter. Kayla, you've gotten a great start on the shelter on the board.
So Chris, if I were going to really go through the process of engineering, we've done a lot of great first work. We've asked questions. We've done experiments and made observations so that we could make sound decisions. We've started to draw. Things that we would want to do more in our drawing are specifics. How big? Exactly how thick? Exactly what kind? How much? The next thing we would want to do is to actually build it and test it. Engineers never get things right the first time. They not only do they not get right the first time, but they sometimes have to do it 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 12, 15, 100, 300 times, even though they made all of their decisions based out of experiments and observation. But that's what's fun about it. It's about learning through the process. And once a design is done, it's still not done. How many different iPhones have there been? iPhone was great when it first came out, but now we're looking at 12, 13, 14 different designs since the beginning. So engineering really never stops until there's a great product.
We took you all through the very beginning of the engineering design process that Kayla told you all about just now. We'd like you to continue the engineering design process. We talked to you a little bit about what sort of things to consider when building this animal shelter, but we think it would be really fun for you to create your own design. It doesn't have to look like ours. Don't go with an igloo shape. Don't use wood. Probably don't make it purple, but that's all up to you. What we challenge you to do is to put on your engineer's caps, to use the engineering design process, just like researchers all over the place, including at DTRA, do every day. See what you can do about designing a shelter to keep animals warm during a snowstorm that's unexpected. And we would love for you to share that information with us. Take a picture of your design and please have your teacher or parent email it to us. We want to see all of your great designs. They can email us at k12@orau.org. And we would love to take those designs, see what kind of cool engineering you've done, and share them with everyone on our website. We'll send you a link to our website so that you can see where they're posted after we get to take a look at your great designs. And you can check out our website. On the screen, you can see it there now. You'll see lots of STEM outreach programs that we do for the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. And we'll also post your great designs there. Thank you so much for tuning in and doing some science and engineering with us today. We'd like to thank the Discovery Festival for hosting us. We're so glad that we were able to be here. And we really appreciate all of you. We hope you learned something, and we hope that you have a great rest of your day.
Awesome. And we did post that inside of our YouTube chat as well. So if you're looking for that email and that website, we'll have that up on our YouTube chat as well. And of course, this whole video will be available as a recording. So if there's something you want to rewatch or something you want to dive deeper on, I will invite you all to please take a look at that. Thank you so much, DTRA's STEM Outreach. That was absolutely fantastic. We're so happy that they joined us today on the stream. And just as a reminder too, what's awesome is that they're coming back on. So DTRA's coming back on. I'm pulling up my schedule here. And don't forget, you can access the schedule at discoveryfestnm.org. And you can see the full schedule of events for the rest of the month. But DTRA, the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, is coming back on let's see here. Where's my calendar? This Thursday, the 19th at 1 p.m. They're coming back on at 1 p.m. for a middle school presentation, which is going to be a blast. So please check that out if you're in middle school or know a middle schooler. You can send them that link as well. And then they are coming back on as well on Monday, the 23rd at 9:30 a.m. for our high school students. So that's going to be awesome. I really got a huge kick out of their presentation. It was such a blast. And as a reminder, we also have CNM coming on this afternoon, and be sure to please check out that schedule there as well. As we wrap up here, I want to give a final shout out to all of our wonderful sponsors. Again, without their support, none of what you're seeing today would be possible. So a big shout out to, of course, Honeywell, Fidelity Investments, Aztec Machine Repair, Air Force Research Laboratories, the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, Micronet Solutions, Presbyterian Hospitals, and Sandia National Laboratories. Thank you so much. And hey, we'll see you guys at 1 p.m. Don't forget to use that chat for the live stream. Thank you all so much. Stay healthy, stay safe, and we will see you soon.